Former child star Danielle Spencer, best known for playing Dee Thomas on What's Happening, has died.
That sentence rang out like the closing of a childhood film for millions of viewers. A world where a bright-eyed, quick-witted little girl with a mischievous smile once lit up the television screen. But for Danielle, behind that innocent laughter lay not only the glow of fame, but also long suffocating silences and psychological wounds that never fully showed yet smoldered throughout her life. Before she closed her eyes for the last time, she left behind a strange gift, a list of 7 names. Each name was not simply someone she had disliked, but a chapter filled with its own backdrop conflicts and hard-earned lessons about trust, friendship, family, and the dark side of show business. For Danielle, this was not an indictment, but 7 mirrors, reflecting the full journey she had traveled from the bright lights of the set to the long years of battling illness. Who tops this list? And behind each name, how much pain did it take for Danielle to carry it with her for life? Let's step into this journey where each story is a puzzle piece that makes up the true person Danielle Spencer was. Since the story of Danielle's 7 final names came to light, people have begun to revisit the relationships that once accompanied her both on set and in real life. And at the very start of that list was none other than Fred "Rerun" Barry, the colleague with his signature dance moves, but also the man who nearly derailed Danielle's career through schemes that seemed harmless at the time. Fred "Rerun" Barry, the shadow behind the backstage smile. In the memories of many American viewers of the 1970s, Fred "Rerun" Barry was a familiar figure. The tilted red beret, the round frame, the comical dance moves, and the wide beaming smile on screen. In What's Happening, he was the heart of the laughs, a kind friend to every character. But through the eyes of young Danielle Spencer back then, Uncle Fred carried a different story, not a loud act of betrayal, but a quiet shift from closeness to distance, leaving behind a gap that was hard to name. In 1976, What's Happening premiered and quickly achieved impressive ratings, becoming one of ABC's most beloved family sitcoms. The success of the first season propelled its main cast into the spotlight. Fred Barry, originally a talented dancer from the group The Lockers, drew particular public attention. Offers for commercials, TV appearances, autograph sessions, doors were opening everywhere. And it was at that moment that murmurs of contracts not paying their worth began circulating in the dressing rooms. By the second season, 1977 to 1978, Barry no longer hid his dissatisfaction with pay and working conditions. In an episode titled, "If I'm Elected," when his request for a raise went unmet, he and Ernest Thomas abruptly walked off the set. The scene they were filming was supposed to feature both main characters, but the director was forced to improvise with only Haywood Nelson as Dwayne. For Danielle, then just 12 years old, and still recovering from a serious accident in 1977, this was the first time she saw a scene abandoned, not due to technical issues, but because of an adult dispute with the producers. It left her with an unsettling feeling: could everything stop at any moment without warning? On the surface, Danielle still called Fred Uncle Rerun and smiled when he teased her between takes. But underneath, she began to feel a new boundary, a backstage Fred Barry, where the laughter wasn't as carefree as it looked on camera. When the third season began, Barry pushed for a raise again, this time, more forcefully. He was absent from the episode Dee the Cheerleader, an episode centered on Danielle's character. His purposeful absence meant she had to carry part of the episode's energy without the familiar co-star at her side. It wasn't just a script gap, it was an emotional gap, when someone who once felt like a safe presence stepped away just when you needed them. Danielle's reaction at the time wasn't an outburst of anger, but a sadness she struggled to express. She later recalled sitting quietly in a backstage corner, overhearing the crew's chatter, scanning the room for a familiar gaze to anchor her. Barry still joked with her the next time they met, but she couldn't shake the question. Did you think about the kids when you walked off? At 13, she didn't yet grasp labor rights or actor contracts. What she understood was that the show felt like a family, and that family now had cracks no one seemed willing to mend. Looking back as an adult, Danielle didn't deny Barry's professional reasons. In the entertainment industry, especially for black actors in the 1970s, demanding fair pay wasn't just a personal right, it was part of a broader movement for recognition of creative labor. Barry, with his experience and stature, may have believed he was doing the right thing. But for a child actor, watching the fun big brother walk away from a scene meant losing a source of emotional security. Danielle's hurt wasn't about the reason, it was about the feeling of being left alone on stage. Barry passed away in 2003, taking with him both his on-screen smile and his backstage controversies. In her later years, Danielle said she had let go of some of the old feelings, but she could never erase the memory of those empty set days. Her story with Fred Barry was not only about a colleague, but about the limits of kinship when tested by self-interest and principle. And then, like an underground current, that memory led Danielle to another relationship where her big brother on screen also left her feeling shaken and abandoned. Ernest Raj Thomas, the next name, in her journey of confronting the past. Ernest Raj Thomas, when the big brother image began to waver. In Danielle Spencer's memory, Ernest Raj Thomas was once a steady shoulder to lean on. Nearly 15 years her senior, he was both her main co-star in What's Happening and a true older brother figure off camera. Ernest was the one who would hold Danielle's hand as they walked onto set, straighten her collar before the director called action, and whisper a quick joke in her ear to ease her nerves. In the early years, his presence felt like a guarantee that this on-screen family was always a safe place. But that sense of safety began to crack when a wave of dissatisfaction over pay and working conditions swept through the cast. Fred Barry was the most vocal, but what Danielle didn't expect was that Ernest, the big brother she trusted, would choose to stand on the same side. In the second season, Ernest stayed quiet, but by season 3, 1978-1979, when Barry renewed his push for higher pay, Ernest not only supported him, but also missed some filming sessions alongside him. Most notably, the episode Dee the Cheerleader, which centered on Danielle's character, ended up missing both Barry and Ernest. This didn't happen overnight. Danielle recalled sensing the serious conversations between the main cast and producers, the quiet click of doors closing after private meetings. When she was told Ernest wouldn't be filming that day, she initially assumed it was a health issue. It wasn't until she overheard crew members murmuring about a strike and demanding rights that she realized it was a deliberate choice. For a 13-year-old, the information was both vague and heavy, like realizing the big brother who always joked with you had suddenly vanished just when you needed him. Danielle's first reaction was confusion. Unlike Fred Barry, Ernest was someone she admired not just for his acting, but for how he cared about his co-stars. His decision to stand with Barry left her wondering, was he thinking about us kids, or only about what he wanted, a question she carried for years? In her memory, she sought Ernest out after a shoot to ask him directly, but his answer circled around grown-up matters and what's best for everyone. At the time, Ernest wasn't just Dee's big brother. He was also a young black actor navigating an era when Hollywood still held deep inequities. Supporting Barry may have been his way of asserting fair treatment for the whole cast, including the younger actors. But the gap between ideals and the immediate impact was wide. The production lost its rhythm. Key episodes lacked central characters, and the atmosphere of trust within the family began to fray. At a deeper level, this raised a question. Can someone maintain the image of a guiding figure while taking part in struggles that risk dividing the group? Ernest never lost his kindness, but in Danielle's eyes, the image of the big brother who never leaves you behind had been shaken. That shake wasn't loud or dramatic. It simmered quietly, like a rope pulled a little tighter each day. Years later, the two reconnected. Ernest was the one who introduced Danielle to her second husband, a gesture that showed their bond had never truly disappeared. But in telling the story, Danielle still admitted she had once hated Ernest for a time, not because he fought for rights, but because the way he fought made her feel abandoned. Perhaps this was the experience that gave Danielle a broader understanding in relationships, especially within creative ensembles. Trust and consistent presence matter as much as lofty goals. Sometimes, an action intended for the greater good can still create distance in the closest bonds. And that distance, even if bridged later, leaves its mark in memory. From the image of an on-screen big brother who was once her anchor, the story leads us to another figure, not a peer, but the one who held ultimate authority over the entire production. His decision would abruptly close the chapter of What's Happening, opening a new and far more challenging era in Danielle's life. Mabel "Mama" King, the on-screen mother and the backstage battle. Within the warm world of What's Happening, Mabel King was the emotional anchor, a steadfast black mother, strict yet loving, who always knew how to guide the kids in the show, and often in real life, back on track. To Danielle Spencer, Mabel was more than a co-star. She was a role model for a grown woman who was strong, self-assured, and knew exactly what she wanted. In those early filming days, Danielle could still recall the big, warm, steady hands of Mabel fixing the ribbon in her hair, or the proud, "You did great, Dee," that followed each scene. But behind that warmth, a quiet tension began to grow between Mabel King and the production team. As season 2 began, Mabel expressed her wish for her character to have more depth. Specifically, she proposed bringing back her character's ex-husband to reunite the family, giving audiences a portrayal of a complete black family, countering the stereotype of the single mother struggling to raise kids that was common on television at the time. This was not just a personal wish. It reflected a cultural aspiration to present a more positive whole image of the community on national television. However, the writers and producers led by Saul Turteltaub had a different view. They wanted to maintain the light-hearted, teen-focused sitcom formula without delving into complex family structures. The discussions became increasingly tense, and soon Mabel's role began to shrink. Her screen time diminished. In some episodes, Mama was only mentioned, but never appeared. On paper, the scripts explained it as her character being away. In reality, everyone understood it was the result of creative disagreements. For Danielle, just 13, at the time, the sudden absence of her mother was a shock. The set, once filled with Mabel's warm, rich laughter, felt emptier. There was no one to hold her at the end of a tough scene, no one to gently adjust her lines, so Dee's voice sounded more natural. Danielle remembered the sense of loss when she was told Mabel would be leaving after season 2. At the time, she didn't understand the reasons, only that someone she trusted was gone, and the hurt quickly morphed into a feeling of abandonment. As an adult, Danielle came to see the story from multiple angles. She understood that Mabel King wasn't just an actress in a sitcom, she was an artist with creative ideals and a sense of community responsibility. She faced down a conservative production system, knowing it could cost her the role. In the context of late 1970s American television, that choice was an act of courage. But that courage in that moment created an emotional void that wasn't easy for a young girl who saw her as a second mother to fill. In entertainment, every principled stand can be a chance for change, but it may also come at the expense of personal bonds. For Danielle, this was her first lesson in the duality of affection and ideals. You can admire someone for their principles, yet still carry a scar from the way those principles took them away from you. When Mabel passed away in 1999, Danielle no longer had the chance to say thank you or clear up any lingering misunderstandings. Yet in her final years, she often spoke of Mabel with respect, tinged with sadness. Back then, I didn't understand. Now I know she was fighting for something bigger than all of us. And from the story of her on-screen mother, Danielle's memories drifted toward those who held ultimate decision-making power, the ones whose choices shaped not just a single role, but the fate of the show and the artistic family she had grown to love. Bud Yorkin, the ruthless producer behind the curtain. Bud Yorkin entered Danielle Spencer's life, not as a co-star or on-set mentor, but as a quiet, powerful presence in the background. He never appeared in scenes, never sat at the script table with the child actors, yet his name appeared steadily in the executive producer credit of every What's Happening episode. To a young Danielle at the time, Bud Yorkin was an abstract concept, the big boss somewhere far away making decisions without ever being there. And it was precisely that distance that made her direct encounter with his power such an unforgettable experience. Season 2 of What's Happening started off smoothly, but simmering tensions over pay demands began to build. Fred Barry and Ernest Thomas, two pillars of the show, repeatedly pushed for higher salaries and better working conditions. When filming days were disrupted by walkouts, Bud Yorkin, armed with years of experience from numerous hit sitcoms, chose a hardline approach. He suspended both actors and required them to sign penalty agreements if they repeated the offense. It was the first warning shot that, in his eyes, discipline and control outweighed flexibility. But the breaking point came in season 3. When demands continued and allegations of discrimination rang out in the meeting room, Bud stopped looking for a compromise. Instead, he made a cold decision. What's Happening would cease production. With a single short statement, the future of the entire cast and crew, including child actors like Danielle, was erased. There was no proper final episode, no farewell to the audience, only an empty slot on the schedule the following week. For Danielle, the announcement felt like hearing that a family member had suddenly left without a note. She had no chance to be part of the discussions in those upper floors. Everything came to her through the somber voice of her stepfather reading a letter from the studio. The feeling was a mix of loss and helplessness. Loss of the role that had defined her childhood, loss of the daily rhythm centered around the set. Helplessness because no effort, no desire to hold on carried any weight against the decision of someone who had never sat down to speak with her. Years later, after leaving the entertainment industry, Danielle came to understand the context better. For Bud Yorkin, what's happening was not a family, but a business product. An unstable set meant financial risk. Shutting down the project could have been his way of protecting the company's long-term interests. But the logic of business is cold comfort to a child who feels abandoned. For Danielle, it was the clearest proof that between family and contract, the contract will always win. The Bud Yorkin story was not just a personal turning point. It reflected a broader reality of the late 1970s American entertainment industry power, concentrated in the hands of producers who could decide the fate of a show without weighing emotional bonds or cultural legacy. In such an environment, actors, especially child actors, could easily become replaceable pieces discarded when necessary. Though she learned to see Bud Yorkin with less harshness, Danielle never forgot the hollowness of that day. She once said, "I understand he did what he thought was right, but the price we paid is something no one measured." On the other side, Bud may have viewed the decision as necessary, even knowing it would leave behind wounded hearts. And from the story of the power broker behind the curtain, Danielle's journey of memory moved toward other faces from that same meeting room. Those who not only held the power of production, but also shaped her character and her story through every page of the script. Sowell Turtletaub, the conservative creative mind. In any television production, the executive producer may have the final say, but the true guides of the story are usually the creatives, the ones who lay each brick of the character's world. On What's Happening, Saul Turtletaub filled that role. He was co-founder of Toy Productions, as well as a writer and content supervisor. With a track record of successful sitcoms, Saul was seen as the brain behind the show's comedic rhythm and episode structure. To viewers, his name appeared in the credits. To actors, especially young ones like Danielle Spencer, he was the person who decided how their characters would live, breathe, and grow. Danielle's relationship with Saul began simply. He rarely spoke to her directly, but whenever he stopped by the set, he would smile and offer a few encouraging words. Then subtle changes began to appear in Season 2, when Mabel King, Danielle's on-screen mother, proposed developing the family storyline toward reconciliation, bringing back the father character. For Mabel, this was a chance for audiences to see a fuller, more positive portrayal of a Black family. For Saul, it was an unnecessary detour. He wanted to keep the tried-and-true formula focus on lighthearted situations revolving around the teens and avoid the family drama he believed would slow down the comedy. Refusing an idea is already sensitive. Refusing it firmly leaves a stronger mark. According to some crew members, Saul didn't just reject Mabel's suggestion, he actively adjusted scripts to gradually reduce her screen time. Episodes that originally included heartfelt mother-child talks were rewritten into scenes of sibling banter. Lines with family-focused messages were trimmed down to brief comedic exchanges. For a young actor like Danielle, these were changes that made little sense. All she knew was that Mama Mabel was appearing less and less, and the set felt emptier without her presence. Danielle's reaction at the time was a mix of confusion and caution. She recalled overhearing tense exchanges between Mabel and Saul outside the writer's room. Mabel's voice insistent, Saul's low and curt. The feeling crept into her mind, if an experienced actor like Mabel couldn't protect her role. What would happen to Dee if she didn't stay in line with what the script demanded? That quiet worry made Danielle keep her distance from Saul, even though he remained friendly in person. Looking back, Danielle came to see that Saul hadn't set out to hurt her. He was a creator, defending his vision. A vision that had brought the show success. But from a cultural and social perspective, the situation raised a question. Does clinging to a formula risk missing opportunities to change how a community is portrayed? In the context of late 1970s American television, a fully intact black family on screen wouldn't just have been entertaining, it would have been a socially important message. Saul's conservatism, even if rooted in professional reasoning, helped close the door on that possibility. For Danielle, the lasting lesson wasn't personal blame, but the realization that creative power can also unintentionally narrow the scope of stories worth telling. And every decision made behind the writer's desk, no matter how justified, can leave a long-term impact on the people standing in front of the camera. Bernie Orenstein, the two-faced producer, different in front and behind. If Bud Yorkin was the boss operating from afar, and Saul Turteltaub was the brain at the writer's table, Bernie Orenstein was the one Danielle Spencer saw most often. He was regularly present on set, walking between shooting areas, chatting with the actors and crew. To an 11 or 12-year-old girl, Bernie seemed like a fun uncle who brought candy, patted her on the shoulder, and said, "You did great today." That closeness made Danielle believe he was family, someone she could trust and rely on. That's why when the production crisis erupted in Season 3, Bernie's change in demeanor hit her so hard. Fred Barry and Ernest Thomas went on strike demanding higher pay and better working conditions. The atmosphere was tense. Danielle wasn't in the room during the heated meeting with the lead actors, but she heard about it and felt the aftershock when Bernie entered with none of his usual warmth. When accusations of discrimination came from Barry, Bernie didn't step in to smooth things over as Danielle had imagined he would. Instead, he stood coldly alongside Bud Yorkin in deciding what's happening would end immediately with no further negotiation. For Danielle, the most painful part wasn't just losing the show. It was losing faith in someone she thought would protect the kids in the cast. She still remembered the morning she got the news of the show's cancellation, staring at an empty work schedule and wondering, where's Uncle Bernie? The man who once warmly asked about her day had now become part of the group that shut down the very project defining her childhood. No direct explanation, no personal reassurance. That silence to a child felt like abandonment. Later as an adult, Danielle came to understand that Bernie had to prioritize production interests. He wasn't only concerned with a few actors' feelings, he carried the weight of finances, contracts, and broadcast schedules. Perhaps he truly believed ending the project at that moment was the only way to avoid greater losses. But understanding is one thing. The sting of betrayal from back then stayed exactly where it was. The two sides she felt, Bernie, the cheerful uncle on set, and Bernie, the cold producer in the boardroom, became a memory that was both sad and instructive. On a broader scale, Bernie's story reflected a common paradox in the entertainment industry. The family dynamic on set always coexists with professional roles and power structures. Those who make you feel the most at home can sometimes be the same people who have to make the most distancing decisions. For child actors, this boundary is especially fragile. You trust in affection, but in the end, you're still subject to adult calculations. Danielle once said that if she learned one thing from Bernie Orenstein, it was this: don't mistake sweet words for a long-term guarantee. In show business, kindness and decision-making don't always go hand in hand. And from this experience, her journey of memory moved into a more private territory, where the wounds no longer came from professional decisions, but from a relationship she thought would be the safest harbor of her life: her marriage to Gary Fields. Gary Fields, a marriage that ended in regret. If the events of What's Happening left Danielle Spencer with professional scars, and shaken trust, her relationship with Gary Fields carved out a purely personal wound. Gary wasn't a colleague from the set. He was someone she once believed she would walk with for the rest of her life. They met after Danielle had stepped away from the spotlight, focusing on her career as a veterinarian. Gary, then a media and marketing professional, also became her image manager during the rare occasions she reappeared in public. Their love was initially built on companionship. Gary accompanied Danielle to events, arranged interviews, and helped her participate in reunion specials for the What's Happening cast. In 1999, they married. At 34, Danielle believed she had found a safe harbor, one without scripts or tense production meetings, just a simple shared life and emotional support. But over time, irreconcilable differences began to emerge. Gary was both husband and representative, blending work and private life into one. For Danielle, this dual role sometimes became a source of pressure. when she wanted to pause public activities to focus on her health, especially after spinal surgery in 2004, that left her in a wheelchair for 8 months. Gary leaned toward keeping her visible in the public eye. It wasn't deliberate insensitivity, but in Danielle's eyes, it felt as though he prioritized image over his wife's emotions. The cracks didn't come from a single dramatic event, but from a buildup of small yet lasting moments, a work trip Gary took during a difficult treatment, an unresolved argument about scheduling, long silences at dinner. By 2013, after 14 years of marriage, they divorced amicably, without revealing details. For Danielle, though it was a private failure she rarely spoke about, her initial reaction was to withdraw. Danielle left Los Angeles, moved back near her mother in Virginia, and sought comfort in family and her veterinary work. She confided to a close friend that she felt empty, not because she'd lost a partner, but because she'd lost faith that love could be constant. Over time, Danielle regained her balance, but she couldn't deny that for a period Gary was someone she hated, not out of malice, but from the feeling of being left alone when she needed him most. On a broader level, their marriage reflected a familiar challenge. When love and work intertwine, the boundary between personal care and professional calculation can easily blur. For someone with a showbiz background like Danielle, maintaining a truly private space became even harder. She understood that Gary had his own pressures and perspective, but that didn't erase the disappointment of having placed complete trust in him. In 2014, Danielle remarried, this time to David L. David finding warmth again in a new chapter. But Gary Fields remained on her list of the 7 people she once hated most, as an indelible mark of a relationship that had once been beautiful, then quietly dissolved. And from here, her life story entered its final act, the years battling illness, when her greatest opponent was no longer a person, but a disease that demanded every ounce of her strength to face. Danielle Spencer's life, from the bright lights of what's happening to her final years battling illness, was a journey interwoven with both glory and loss, with relationships that once lifted her up and wounds that never fully healed. The 7 names she left behind were not meant to rekindle grudges, but to remind us that behind every on-screen smile lies a real story, filled with genuine emotions that can sometimes be fragile. If this story resonated with you, support the channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing, so we can continue bringing deeper, more human perspectives on the lives of the artists you love. Together, let's keep their memories and the lessons they left us alive.